We're going to start the East Greenbush Central School District Board of Education meeting. Let's rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We have everyone here today with the exception of Ms. Komersky and Ms. O'Brien. We're going to start today with our student council representatives, Cole Hardy and Nicole. I'm going to get your last name, Crisando, right?
All right. Good evening, everyone. We hope you all had a wonderful break. Since being back from break, we discussed amongst executive council, student council, about our ideas for the 2025 portion of the school year.
We are excited to begin working on the many new ideas that we talked about today. We talked about a March Madness competition, a hot chocolate sale, an end of the year celebration, and a field trip. We plan to use January primarily to organize our ideas and put everything that we talked about today into action.
That's it for us recently. Thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, next on the agenda is approval of the draft minutes. In our prior meeting, Mr. Mann was absent and Ms. Steinbach was absent. Is there any questions or comments on the meeting minutes? None. Is there a motion to approve the minutes? Mr. Buno, is there a second? Ms. Turner, all in favor? Everyone's in, well, not everyone is in favor. Any abstaining? Ms. Steinbach and Mr. Mann, and motion passes, 2 abstentions. All right, next is the board forum. I'm gonna start on my right, Ms. Steinbach.
I'm all set, thank you.
Ms. Phillips.
So on Monday, I went to the Ed Foundation meeting and they are gearing up for Winterfest. So everybody mark your calendars for January 18th at Goff. There's going to be lots going on and they're still looking for volunteers. So if we have any board members that want to volunteer, just let me know. I get to the sign up. Or if any community members want to volunteer, let us know. We'll get to the sign up.
Good pitch.
They still need lots of help.
Mr. Mann. Mr. Buno.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm just going to give an update as I'm going to probably every board meeting from from time now until we find a superintendent. So yeah, just to update everyone where we are with the superintendent search process. As you may recall, we did put out a community survey almost 3 weeks ago that started on December 19th. To date, we have almost 1,000 people have responded to that survey, and that went out to community members. It was on our board, website, things like that. And the survey does close tomorrow, so I want to thank everyone for the feedback. Next steps in the process will be that information will be collected by our search consultant, They will then distill that data and then present to the board on the meeting on January 22nd and give us some information about. And again, this was to inform us on what kind of qualifications we're looking for our superintendent, our next superintendent. And then from there, we'll also post those survey results on the website. And this will inform us in terms of the qualifications that we're going to use for the brochure and application process for the superintendent search. After that board meeting on the 22nd, what we plan on doing is having that position posted to go out to the general public on several different forums, advertising sites, websites, things like that. And again, that will let our applicants or people hopefully who are applying for a superintendent here at East Greenbush. And then we'll have further discussions about the process as it unfolds from the application part. We do have a small search committee internally, members of the board, but we do anticipate that the board members themselves, everybody who's available, will be participating in the interview processes as they unfold. Okay.
Thank you,
So that's my update for this week.
Ms. Van Orton, anything? All right. So moving on to the public forum. I'll read our residents, students, employees, and business representatives of the East Greenbush Central School District may address the board on matters concerning programs and/or operations of the district other than matters involving personnel. Members of the board do not directly respond to citizen concerns during the public forum. If a response is appropriate, either the president or superintendent will contact the individual in the near future. Those persons wishing to address the board will be recognized by the chair of the meeting and should state for the record their name and address or affiliation with the district or business. While the board does not wish to infringe upon free speech protections, it must be stressed that the visitors forum is not deemed to be an open forum. The board president will conduct the forum for the orderly and efficient operation of board business. In addition, any remarks which may be considered defamatory or stigmatizing are prohibited and will be declared out of order. All comments shall be limited to 5 minutes. Are there any comments from the public? All right. And moving on, we're going to have reports and presentations. Mr. Simons.
So a few weeks ago, some of the superintendents in the region and I were at a meeting and we were discussing some issues around the federal funding and some, concerns about some conversations that were occurring nationally as well as within the state about how changes in the U.S. Department of Education and federal funding might impact our schools. So I thought it would be a good idea to revisit the idea of our federal funding allocation that we receive in the district with our board and our community. It's been a while because we were receiving the COVID-related grant funds for some time, which have expired. Just to give us a sense of what do we receive from the federal government, how we spend those monies on programs, and what some of the impact could potentially be in the general fund budget as we continue to proceed through the budget calendar. So Roy and Jennifer put together a very good presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Okay, great. We're gonna over here.
Very good.
Okay.
We have a little tight squeeze over here.
Yeah. Hi, how are you? Hi. Happy New Year, everybody. We're gonna scooch over here so we don't have keep our backs to you. So we're gonna. Okay. Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back. It's good to see everyone back from break. So as Mr. Simon says, we wanted to provide an overview of We wanted to provide an overview of the federal funding allocations. So I'm going to give a little bit about what we are allocated on an annual basis and what those trends were over the last several years. Roy's going to go through some of what the purpose of that funding is and how we utilize that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more, come back to me and talk a little bit more about the budget considerations. Yeah, it's okay. Go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Sure. Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. Now we're in business. So this is the summary of our allocations. The top part of this slide basically goes through all our Title I funds. Roy's going to talk about what they are. So this is the last 5 years of allocations. So for our title funds, our total allocations have been pretty consistent with the exception of 23-24. You do see a higher allocation and then it comes back down in 24-25. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but generally prior to, that change, things have been fairly steady. And then our IDEA funding also has had steady allocations, steadily increasing over the years. The last part of this chart is the CARISA and ARP expenditures. So this was the federal funding that we received as a result, post-COVID. And this just reflects the actual spending that we had on those COVID related funding since most of the funding was in 21-22 and then 22-23, and then it has decreased and now it has expired. So,
Great. Thank you. So I'm just going to talk briefly with the funding that we received through the Title I, II, III, and IV, and really with the purpose, overall general purpose of what that funding is for. And then I'm going to go through and just discuss where we are spending all that money. So Title I,
as you can see, is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and to close achievement gaps. So what we do and all districts do is you identify, school or schools based on poverty levels. So this current school year, we have Donald P. Sutherland identified as our Title I school. So all of our Title I money goes towards Donald P. Sutherland School. Title II funding, really you can think of that as professional development, is to improve the quality and effectiveness of teachers, principals, and school leaders. Title III funding is for English language learners and immigrant students. And then Title IV funding, kind of a general term, is funding to provide well-rounded education, improve school conditions, and improve use of technology. So again, that's just a brief general idea of what the funding is for. Each of the title funding does have some specific regulations around what that money can be used for. So going to our Title I funding, this past year we received just over $251,000. You can see the breakdown of how that money is utilized. I should have mentioned that also the private schools that are within our boundaries that choose to opt in, based on their students, they can receive some portions of that money as well. So again, a large chunk of the money for Title I, we do use to support some salaries for our AS teachers, again, at Donald P. Sutherland. There is some money under what would be called purchase services. That's Holy Spirit School has decided to use their Title I funding in that way. And then as part of Title I, you have to have a homeless reserve. So we have our homeless reserve under materials and supplies, and along with some other supplemental materials. So again, with Title I, it's our largest funding source in the titles. But for example, you could not use your money in Title I to purchase, a core reading program or a core math program. It's supplemental materials and things to support students. So Title II funding, again, think of that as professional development in general. We use about $30,000 to pay for stipends for our content coordinators. And then we looked at some of the remaining money, used that for some embedded professional development, some additional conferences for principals and teacher leaders, and then also some travel expenses that may go along with those types of conferences. And as a total, just over $71,000. Our Title III funding, small amount, $9,877. So with that, whenever your Title III funding is under $10,000, you can't use that money on your own. You have to be part of a consortium. So we're part of a consortium that this year is being led by Questar 3 and Auburn. Auburn is the regional bilingual education resource network, where we pool our money with other school districts that also have under $10,000. Last year and this year, what happens with the consortium is, the group gets together, makes some decisions on how that money is going to be used. When it does get pooled, you still are able, we're not pooling that money and we're only using $5,000 of it and another district might be getting more. We're getting our fair share or full share. That money is being used to do some tutoring for E&L students. That's how the consortium has decided to utilize that money for this coming year and last school year as well. And then again, Title IV, we use that for a good chunk of that for purchase services around SEL and restorative practices. And then again, some supplies and materials that also can support student social emotional learning. So for our IDEA, you have your 611 and 619, again, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So really we're supporting our students with disabilities. Your 611 is kind of that overall to ensure that students are receiving a free and appropriate public education. And then the 619 is a little bit more targeted to support some younger students with disabilities. So with that funding, you'll see we get just over $1 million in our 611 and about $34,000 in our 619. And you can see there how that money is spent. A large chunk of the 611 money is used for FTEs, about $840,000 to support 11 FTEs, which would be some special education teachers, along with some other service providers, and then some stipends that go along with our unified sports program. Again, you'll see some purchase services in there for students that maybe have outside placements outside of the district, and then some materials and supplies as well. And then the $34,000, you can see there how that is broken down. A little bit of a special education teacher salary, and then along with some outside providers and assistive tech services.
Okay. So budget considerations with Title I funding, we don't receive our allocations until after the May budget vote. So this time last year, all spring, we didn't have knowledge, of what the Title I allocation was going to be. Later over the summer into the fiscal year, we were able to receive what our allocation was going to be, and we discovered that there was going to be a decrease of $222,000. So what does that mean? So in the 24-25 budget, the positions that were intended to be funded by the Title I funding were not included in the general fund budget. So that funding decrease, those expenses, those FTEs had to be placed back into the general fund budget, which the general fund is absorbing those expenses. So, so looking forward into 25-26, not knowing what the allocation would be, it would be prudent to consider that those positions should be continued to be funded into the general fund to make sure that we can continue funding those positions.
I have a question, Jen.
Yes.
So the way I'm reading this, it's like we have two buckets of revenue. We have restricted and we have unrestricted. Like restricted revenue coming with very specific ways you have to spend.
Mhm.
So when we look at our total budget, it's like we save the restricted for allocating last to make sure, or first to make sure we hit those markers. So what I'm wondering is like, is this going across the population of our restricted revenues? And I'm just wondering, is there a general trend of restricted versus unrestricted?
So basically, going just back to that very first slide,
Yeah.
that is our allocations of our restricted funds that are dedicated to specific purposes. So our specific title funds, our IDEA funds, they are all, the grant funding allocation.
So that's the total population of all restricted revenues.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you.
These are the annual reoccurring items. So when there's changes in funding, in an intended purpose of how we're normally would fund teachers or other staffing, we need to make sure that we have appropriate funding in the general fund in the event that there's a funding decrease.
Okay.
So in this case, it would be considering, the funding decrease into 24-25, making sure that there's allocations or consider allocations in 25-26 to make sure that that can continue.
Okay.
Not knowing what the 25-26 Title I allocation is going to be.
And
But that's a board decision.
That's right, in consideration.
And that, as a total population, like restricted revenue to the total budget, like how significant would you say like the restricted revenue impacts like the total budget overall, like as a percent basis?
So if we can go back to that very first slide. So the allocations of the federal funding allocations have been pretty consistent from year to year. So you can see that our title allocations have been around that $400,000 to $500,000 mark on an annual basis. And then our IDEA allocations have been at about $1 million. So we're talking about $1.5 million of our federal allocations approximately.
Okay.
Is the trend. So that is the portion that's being funded, by these allocations and is not in the general fund budget.
Thank you.
And the other consideration that we have to be careful when we're thinking about these things is that these funds are supplementing our programs.
Yep.
They're not supplanting. So they can't replace, existing program funds. So that's something else that we have to be mindful of, that we can't just kind of flip, how how we, apportion what goes in, what bucket, as long as we're, supplementing the actual program, in essence, enhancing it. So in terms of that impact, so that's where it's the consideration for the 25-26. How do we address that in next year's budget? So why did it go down? So this was, there's a lot of data that feeds into how the Title I funding is provided. And there's this SAPE, which is a small area income poverty estimate, which is data that the district has no control over. So there's a variety of sources that feed in. Basically, the U.S. Census Bureau calculates this SAPE data, which its primary purpose is to provide allocations to school districts for these Title I funding. So that's the primary purpose of the SAPE data. So what we found, so some of the sources are the American Community Survey, the federal income tax records, SNAP records, personal income estimates, SSI, and a variety of population estimates. There's a lot of statistical data and regression analysis that comes into this SAPE analysis. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is what some of that data looks like. The data is actually a few years old. So the funding year 24-25 is actually SAPE data from 2022. So that is the lag. It's a few year lag. And then that 2022 SAPE data is actually based on federal income tax returns from the year prior to that, 2021. So basically the SAPE data considers the estimated total population, the estimated population for age 5 to 17, and then the estimated number of children in poverty as related to the household. So these factors change from year to year, but you can see in 23-24 that went up quite a bit. And I don't have an exact reason or understanding of why that happened, but what I did see, because I did look at other school districts in the region, and they also had similar increases in that year. And when you think about it and go back, and this is just me reading into it and making assumptions, that 23-24 data is based on 2020 tax return data. And in 2020 was the year of COVID, and there was a lot of unemployed individuals. So perhaps that might be a reason. So this is really what is feeding into those funding allocations, and generally that increase in the poverty number gave our allocation in 23-24 a much higher number than it had been previously. And then this year for 24-25, it had decreased more substantially than it was 2 years prior, which led to the decrease in the funding allocation. So just a couple of considerations, Carissa, just to reflect on, what was spent in prior years and what has happened in terms of expenditures programs that had continued after the expiration of those Carissa and ARP expenditures. So basically in 24-25, we had about $76,000 remaining, which funded the Elevate K-8 program that was held at Goff. So that will be something that will need to be reviewed by the board for consideration as to whether or not that program continues into 25-26, as that funding will no longer be available. And whether or not the general fund budget would fund that. And then just some historical information, programs that remained in 23-24, the general fund budget absorbed about $1.1 million of expenditures, and then 24-25, about another $500,000 of that.
So again, just some takeaways is, one is really looking at our grant funding, the title funding, and the IDEA funding. They are definitely critical in helping us meet the needs of all of our students. I feel like we do a really great job of utilizing that money, trying to target that money to make sure that we are, meeting the different needs based on the regulations on how that money can be spent. Also, efficient use of resources to ensure that the programs that we are funding are reaching our intended students.
And then just the last 2 points, just reviewing and what are the challenges to ensure that we're continuing to meet the needs of our students with even a decrease in federal grant funding and, absorbing those ARP CRISA expenditures. And then just really looking at the 25-26 budget to address any funding gaps and ensure, program continuity to the extent possible. So any other questions?
I'm just wondering, I know we don't have any control over the state data, but do we have any way to kind of predict it all when we're making our budget?
So there may be some information. So there may be information in terms of the data points that comes out sometime this spring that may be informative. But again, that was just in terms of how that data is fluctuating.
Right.
Then there's the second component of what's being actually allocated to the states and then is allocated out from there. So it is complicated. So making assumptions, perhaps maybe a couple more years of data, especially, one of the things that, came out of the COVID years is nothing is certain, things change. And so trends kind of aren't as predictable in certain areas. So we need to be cautious until we have enough historical data to see how that behaves.
I was going to add to that is, we have been pretty stable up
Right.
until that
Right.
2 year where we got the large jump and then a significant decrease. But prior to that, we were, like you said, pretty stable, a
Right,
slight
right.
increase every year. So that was the assumption
Yep.
going into it. And then
Yep.
surprisingly, we got,
Mhm.
some extra money one year, which was great. And then surprisingly on the other end, we got less.
Well, and to your point, Jennifer, I mean, I think you're right about the tax changes in 2020 and then in 2021 with the child income tax credit. We
Mhm.
saw a shift in the poverty rate for children. So that might have been why we saw that decrease in
Mhm.
24, 25. So I'm just, if we can make any predictions, it helps with budgeting, but if we
Right.
can't, then
Right.
I guess assume the worst.
I think over time, as Roy said, we had stability.
Yeah.
There's a lot of predictability. So now to see how things are behaving will help develop what those trends are and how much we can rely on it and make reasonable, predictions.
Kathy, I think you bring up a good point because it's related to your income, tax and assuming that it's the 5 to 7-year-olds, the person how they're dependent, right? Who's filing for them or who's claiming them, right? Is how it would get allocated. And we know that there's already going to be a tax rebate. And now it was just announced that the children and families tax is significantly increasing. So it'll be interested to see what happens. We won't see it, this year, but it'll be next year as well, how that affects these kinds of numbers.
So just one point I want to reiterate is the federal funds as a percentage of our overall budget are very small. We're not a high needs district where some districts in our area receive millions of dollars in Title I funds. But it is a factor that does impact our budget, particularly if they're mandated services that we're funding, such as AIS and counseling services and special education services that are required to have regardless of funding source. So those are conversations that will become more clear as we get into the general fund budget within the next few weeks. But it's just important to know that we do target these monies towards what they're supposed to be spent on. And because it's such a small allocation, there's very little discretion in terms of moving the money around. We have to comply with the regulations, and then there's the mandated services within those areas, with the exception of the Title IIA, which is for professional development. We try to use those monies for things that we are doing to help the general fund, but also that move the curriculum and professional development forward.
Can you go back to that slide? I just want to keep in mind that bottom part of that slide, board members who weren't here when this first came into play. We've absorbed a substantial amount of monies into our general fund budget because of meeting the needs of our students and families, which I support wholeheartedly. The question is the sustainability of this. So some important decisions are going to be made in this next budget cycle about sustainability. That's something, we come to that conversation next week in our budget workshop.
Yeah.
We'll have to address those things.
And I want to piggyback on that. And it's like for me, like as Mr. Simons was saying, how it's a small percentage of our budget. I think, there's a bigger picture also with state funding, right? It's not just. I think this is kind of a precursor, right, to the uncertainty that we face in the future. So I don't envy the position of bearing the news of the uncertainty, right, of the future. And I just want to, so I'll save the rest of my conversation for the budget workshop. But that's just what I'm thinking, is that this kind of, there's more to the picture. And I think, the 1% here, but.
The governor's state of the state is next week, so we'll learn a little bit more about what her thinking is. And then on the 21st of January, she's scheduled to release her budget. So we're into the season.
Or
Yeah.
before.
The Title I and Title IV, you called out Holy Spirit. Is that the only program that's eligible, or how is that?
They are for this year, yes, they're the only private school that opted in to participate,
Okay.
yes.
Mr. Stiles, I think it's true. Is it still true that the state tells you what their allocation is? Like, we don't have any discretion over how much money Holy Spirit is entitled to. The state tells you that number, right? To
Yes
some
and
degree.
no. So we do not have discretion. It's a per pupil amount.
Okay.
So the amount of money that is received gets broken up between the per pupil amount for our students and the Holy Spirit students. So it might be $1,200 per pupil, and that's where their amount comes from. And then, our amount. Yes, there's no real discretion.
Good job. Thank you both.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next on our list is the Donald P. Sutherland water heater issues potential emergency project. Mr. Simons.
Yeah, so at the last board meeting, we asked Mr. Bickle to report on something that I'd made the board aware of. The hot water heating system at Donald P. Sutherland is failing, and we're going to need to replace it. Paul Bickle provided some information, general information. We've been working on this. We don't have a full estimate of the cost, but Turner Construction and Labella Associates, our architect, have been working on. They've sent engineers over to look at the system. They've sized up what they believe is needed, and we're putting some cost estimates to it, which we hope to have for you on January 22nd. Jana, do you want to start this, or do you want me to turn it over to Paul? Or they've been working on this every day over the holidays as well. So Paul, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I did introduce this at the last board meeting. Unfortunately, we got to the point to where, just as a recap, one of the hot water heaters was already down and had been disassembled and was not repairable. So we were looking to actually do a repair out of our budget, the operations and maintenance budget, where we would replace just one of the hot water heaters at this point in time. But then when school started off, the other one started to deteriorate very quickly. And unfortunately is probably just barely hanging on right now. So I went to Mr. Simons and Mrs. Mulligan and told them about such a situation. And it's not a situation that can be put on hold, unfortunately. Even though you can operate a school technically with SCD without having hot water, we don't want to. So we decided, we took a look at it. Could we fit it into the current capital project, or should we go ahead and run this alongside of it as an emergency project? So the outcome of that discussion was, let's go ahead and make it an emergency project. We'll be able to move forward with it a little bit quicker, and we'll actually get reimbursed separately from the project. So with that said, Thankfully, we're already working with Labella Associates and Turner Construction on the capital project, so they were able to step in and do a lot of the behind the scenes work that's necessary for these kind of projects. And basically what that is, it's they sent out an engineer, they went through the whole system. We looked at different ways in which we may use the system in the future. There's already a plan to replace the hot water heaters there, but there was not a plan to replace these domestic hot water heaters. What I meant is we're replacing the boilers that actually heat the building. So these had just been replaced in 2016 project. So we had no inkling that they were going to fail at this point. They're only 8 years old. So they weren't even in the building condition survey as failing. So thankfully with the work of Labella and Turner, James from Turner Construction met one of the construction companies out there to help us get kind of some insight into how best to go about it after taking in what the engineer had brought to them. And we came up with 2 options basically. So yeah, sure. If you want to talk about this first one, you want to flip that over.
So yeah, we met out there yesterday morning. We took a look at the mechanical room, looked at both of those existing water heaters, came back and had a separate meeting with Paul with the trade partners that I have brought out there. So we did come up with this first option, which is definitely the preferred option, which would be to demolish the existing water heaters, clean off everything, make a larger concrete pad to accept not only 2 stainless steel tanks, but also 2 separate smaller boilers to heat those things. You have the redundancy that SED requires. So if something should happen again, you've always got a backup system running. The other thing we looked at the sizing that Labella came up with. We wanted to verify that not only what we're looking at can be installed, but is going to be capable to service DPS when we do come out to phase 5 and we add in an addition, more classrooms, more services. We don't want to put something in and you got to take it out in 3 or 4 years. So it'll all work there. The other thing we looked at, that's an oil system. And right now, currently, there is no natural gas in Nassau. I was surprised by that, but I don't go up there very often. So we did, if for some reason we do find that it is become usable out there, which is definitely more energy efficient, these 2 new boilers that we would put to heat the steel water tanks you could switch the burner out and make them not only just oil, we could switch them out to natural gas or propane if that became the way we wanted to go. As far as the boilers go and everything, this would be it's an energy thing. It would be about 85% because it's oil, and that's really the best you're going to get there. Along with this, what we're looking at is also to install new ductwork, breaching, and new piping and valves is needed. But we felt that a lot of the stuff we could reuse and attach in there. And again, we ran all this by Paul, and we have the other option. I'm going to flop over to that. So the other option would be just to take. Oh, well, the other option should be to replace in that kind what was there. There's option 2 right there. It's basically the same thing, except instead of doing all this, you're just replacing the 2 existing water heaters. The problem with that is these things are enormous. You can't just get those off of the street. You're looking at an 8 to 12 week lead time. I don't know the exact cost, but the cost is probably going to be exponentially higher because it's a special order item. The other option you were looking at, those are in stock items. The boilers, probably 2 week lead time, and also for the tanks, probably another 2 weeks. So if we got all the pricing, we get everything together, everything's approved by the board, there's that potential we could get this thing done like on a school break, on like a February break, just go in there, replace it, demolish everything and replace in that kind. So when the students come back, we at least have one going, so they have hot water. Do you want to talk, anybody? That's any questions or?
Do you have a rough estimate of what we're looking at for a cost?
Currently, right now, I don't want to comment on it right now. We just received some of that. We wanted to confirm some of the design stuff before we stepped further in. But we did get that confirmation today from Labella. So I've already fed that into our trade partners. So we are right now, I'm hoping by the end of this week, we'll have pricing. I'll get that into Paul and his team.
Would any of this be SED reimbursed?
Yes, Jennifer has been working with the attorneys. There's a memo that she received this afternoon. There's two types of emergency projects. The first type is a state emergency, which means if the state agrees that it's a state emergency, then we get the aid back in the following year. We get it all back. If it's not, it'll be over the 15-year period. And so we have a process recommended by the attorneys that would include you guys reviewing it and passing a resolution, hopefully on the 22nd, and we'll have the cost estimate done.
I'm wondering, like, I just want to
So
piggyback.
either way, it's eligible for aid. It's dependent. It could be all paid back one year or versus the 15 years.
And we need to still have conversations with SED.
Right.
So-
Right.
There you go.
So once the board declare emergency, we can start put the project. If we have a design done and everything, we can put the project for bid. We don't have to do a public bid. It's enough to receive 3 numbers because it's an emergency. So you don't have to go through the process of, for 4 weeks for bidding and stuff like that. The SED, New York State Education Department, comes in play to decide if it is a 1-year reimbursable or a 15-year reimbursable. The district board controls the emergency. Once they declare an emergency, so we can move forward. We will submit all the paperwork to SED, all the drawings to SED in a later date. We don't have to follow the procedure that first you design, submit to SED, you get approval, then you'll be able to bid. In this case, once we put it together, enough documentation that 2-3 company can provide the pricing, we will be done and then provide to SED. We have to do an LOI, that's required because we have to put a project number, project review number, but we don't have to submit to SED, New York State Education Department, prior to bidding or do the job. I've done other emergency project and we finish the job, close out everything, and then we submit to New York State. So
Question.
Yep.
Is there a difference between the timeline of an emergency versus submitting it as part of the capital project?
Yeah.
And along with that, is there a difference in the reimbursement rate from the capital project versus an emergency? Like, I'm wondering both sides, time and.
So if we put under the capital project, we have to follow the normal procedure. So we design everything, we submit to SED. We have to wait for their approval before we put up for bid.
Yeah.
And they will require probably right now it's between 20 and 22 weeks review for the engineering. If it was architecture, it's lower, but this is only engineering. So we have to go through the process. The emergency will take the piece out. For the reimbursable, as a timeline, we cut a lot of month. As far as reimbursable, again, if SED will look through the process, through the document and say, yep, this actually is, let's call level 1 and level 2. Level 1 emergency, higher emergency, you get the money the next year. The reimbursable gets the next year. If they say, well, yeah, it's an emergency, but the school can be still operate, even though without hot water. So they say, well, you get the money. So now you get the money at the same time, like the capital project, 15 or, yeah.
It's the same percentage though, is it not?
Yeah. it would be
Yes,
the same
percentage
aid
is the same.
ratio that we would be getting under the capital project.
Right.
Actually, because the aid would likely start flowing sooner than our capital project, because even under our first phase 1A, we wouldn't be submitting final cost reports until that particular project is done.
Right.
Which we're still, which is 2 years from now, until we submit final cost reports before aid starts flowing on that.
Flowing, yeah.
On that first phase 1A. And the other consideration too is we're just starting the capital project.
Yeah.
So, this is different scope than what was in the capital project. So we need to make sure we consider that and make sure we carry out the priorities that we had.
What's required for the board to declare it as an emergency project?
A letter from the architect, and
Which has what in it?
it's just a letter that we have evaluated the existing condition and from our,
Statement.
yes, there's a,
No,
We need a
just-
letter.
My point is gonna be is, why wait till the 22nd if we have some time on the 15th? We don't, I mean, I guess, to me,
It's
this
an
is already emergency.
Yeah.
So,
If we can
Why
get
can't we
everything
do
ready
something
by
on the
the,
15th,
we
a
have a special
resolution?
meeting on the 15th.
oh,
we don't really, I mean, the numbers are gonna be the numbers.
I think it,
So
once,
the
once,
numbers is
Letter.
really the last
yeah, it's the
component
last piece.
Well,
that we
it's an
need.
emergency in
And-
my mind.
Right. And
Gotta
there
do
is a
something.
meeting on the 15th. So there may be an opportunity.
Right.
Gonna do a resolution then. It's gonna cost, it's gonna cost.
Yeah.
I mean, the kid's gotta have, I mean, my opinion is,
Yeah.
have a hot water building,
Right.
right, Jack? You know, hot water, right?
Right. It's in the kitchen. It's kind of this
Yeah.
part of the kitchen. So
Option 3 wasn't up there, and that was to run hot water from Genie's
So, I mean, I'm just thinking, from a practical standpoint, there's expediency to get things going. Why wouldn't the board just want to do some kind of resolution to say, this is an emergency project, we support it? Go forth and get the numbers and get things going with SCP, so you're at least have more lead time.
yes,
I know the break is the break, but.
right.
Getting things done. but
The other,
having
the
it in
other,
sight, ready to go.
Yeah.
the other piece can be, put an amount in a resolution,
Right.
and hopefully we don't go over the amount.
We'll just stay out of
In
trouble.
case, I think I feel comfortable with James,
Eyeball.
pull some spring and stuff, he can get the number probably, if not by the end of the week, early next week. So probably you will get everything by then.
I just have one question. Did you say, Paul, that these here only lasted
Yeah.
8 years?
Years. And these up next ones, the new ones will last more than that.
I hope so.
So that was my question as well. Like looking at option 2, where we're basically replacing as is, would we be running the risk of those dying in 8 years as well?
Probably.
Yeah, I went
Is
once.
option 1, would that potentially, do we have faith that would last longer?
Yeah,
No, go ahead.
So we're gonna put in stainless steel tanks. We're gonna put in special stainless steel boilers. So right now there's 2 components out there. There's tanks with built-in heating elements in them. So there's only 2 components. This will be 4 components. So it'll make it easier in the future. Say if a tank starts leaking, we can just get a tank and pop a tank in. If a boiler starts leaking, they're less expensive components to replace at that point than this gigantic all-in-one unit. And that's why we'd rather go this route.
And would option 2 definitely need to be replaced or upgraded with the capital project at DPS in a few years?
It's questionable just because we haven't, that's phase 5. So we haven't even got into the design phase of what we're going to do with the boilers there. Again, we only have oil there. We're going to look into obviously every avenue we can. Is there natural gas nearby? Which we did a quick check. Doesn't appear there is. Is propane a viable alternative? We're going to have a huge tank above ground there somewhere. So we're really limited by what we have to work with right there. And that's oil. And you can only get so much efficiency out of oil. So again, we never got to that point, but at least this point sets us up for either option because they're dual fuel basically. Any other questions?
We're gonna strive to get it done and ready for the 15th. Yeah. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Let's don't forget, we have to do secra. And
Yeah.
this is just, type 2 secra. We have already the resolution that Jen was ready to
Yep, we have,
do it.
yeah, so there's two resolutions, the
Yep.
secret action.
Yep.
Type 2, and then the ordinary contingent expense emergency
Right.
resolution. So they're basically ready to go once we have the number.
So,
Thank you.
good.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a backup plan if it goes tomorrow.
Yeah, I guess like they said,
That'll be a real emergency.
we will get out of the function.
Right.
Okay. Moving on to the EPA.
It's like the broadcast.
So our next item is discussion item regarding the district's interest in applying for round 4 funding for the EPA Clean School Bus Program. The district has applied in the past. We were unsuccessful. I think we were waitlisted. And we do need to move forward to some degree to prepare the district for the mandate, which is that by 2027, we are ensuring that we are prepared for the fact that in New York State, no one will be selling anything but zero emission buses. And also by 2035, there is a mandate that the entire fleet be EV. Many districts, school groups are advocating to change these timelines. They haven't been changed, but more funding has been made available and more ability for the district to move forward and secure the funding has also been provided. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to explain this. And Dr. Wanda McQueen is here as well to help explain what the current thinking is on where we might go with bus purchases if we receive this money.
So thank you, Mr. Simons. The purpose of tonight is to talk about just the EPA round 4. In order to actually apply for that funding, we need to make sure that the board is aware that we are applying and making a consideration. There's no commitment that is being made at this time. So basically, I had provided a memorandum about that. Basically, the EPA round 4 funding is a lottery. So it's basically, and we're not a disadvantaged district, so we're not a priority district. So, it's like a lottery. So the chances of getting it is, we will have to wait and see. But there's been a lot of things that have changed over the last year in terms of some of the funding mechanism. One of the other fundings that we have available, which is an application that is made by the vendor, which Leonard Bus Sales is our current bus vendor under state contract. So they have access to NSBIP, which is the New York State Bus Incentive Purchase Program. And that funding is out there and is available. There's vouchers sitting, waiting for us in the event we decide to execute on them. So the EPA funding can provide up to $170,000, but it would be limited to $100,000 for each bus purchase because of the NSBIP funding that would be available to us. So there's also tax incentives, tax credits that we can apply for. We would have to file a nonprofit tax form to receive them. So there are other funding mechanisms. New York State had also changed some of the aid mechanisms for EV buses. They now will aid on the gross cost of the bus versus the net cost after these funding initiatives. So it's created a situation where it's almost like negative aid, where the actual net cost after aid could be close to zero versus purchase of fuel buses. And then in addition, there's also funding for chargers and things of that nature. Also, actually, just recently, late in the fall, I believe it was, they also changed the period of amortization of the aid. Previously, it was over a 12-year period. A lot of feedback was received that these new EV buses only have a useful life of 8 years. versus the 10 or 12, with the fuel buses. And so that is also providing an incentive to be able to kind of keep the buses on the same schedule that the aid would be rolling in on them. So there's a lot of things that we need to take a look at in regard to what direction we ultimately go when it comes to the May vote for this. But at least we want to make sure that the board is supportive of putting in an application for the EPA funding. It is up to 4 large buses, this particular application. Whether, how we go about that, we won't hear about the funding until sometime in April, I believe, whether or not we were selected. But we'll need to look at our bus reserve and, the ultimate net cost of these. So I didn't know if anybody had any questions or.
I have a quick
Dr.
question.
McKinney?
I'm wondering, just from a budget planning perspective, is there any advantage to having EV buses just for planning future budgets versus not having them? Because just in my mind, thinking about the mandate and the position that the mandate puts us in and how could we accomplish getting there, in my mind, it just makes sense to have some sort of buses in our inventory to define what the expenses look like. And I was just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. Dr. McLean and I had been talking about, actually there's a fleet electrification study that needs to occur. There is some funding through NYSERDA for that. We have to do some research on that. That would really be the next step in terms of taking a look at what we need to do. We'd have to engage, with our architect, Labella and Turner too, to partner, on that. And to consider that in terms of getting started with, I'm not an engineer or designer or architect or anything, but a couple of buses and a couple of chargers, I don't know how big of a lift in terms of infrastructure that is. That was something we had talked about last year. Dr. McQueen, do you have any comments on that?
I think one important thing, good evening, everybody. I think a couple of important items with that is we're not just looking, we had a fleet study done a couple of years ago. We got it done through Corny's Technology, who is associated and partnered with Leonard's Bus Sales, our current vendor. But that was a very small fleet study in the respect that they simply looked at our current routes 2 years ago, which have changed dramatically. We now have an additional 4 this year, for example. And when they looked at that, the current technology a couple of years ago, and of course, EV technology is moving at a very fast and rapid pace, that technology could not, based on that fleet study, could not sustain our small bus fleet on the current routes that we had 2 years ago. In other words, our small buses, which you would think might be easier to make EV, they travel farther, they're on the road longer. And given our terrain, we were basically in the red, as that we would have to charge them at some point during the day. They would not be able to do their morning and afternoon runs without being recharged. So in looking at that, we worked with them to identify replacing the large buses first. Our large buses we would have, if we ended up getting the grant funding, which is good timing right now with the additional gross sales that they're putting, or gross profit that they're putting for our aid. So we're basically could be at a point where the district's not outlaying anything per EV large bus. So it's really good timing. We would have an option of our 56 or 57 current large bus routes we operate every day. We would have probably 30 to 35 routes currently this year that could be sustained with current EV technology if we went with large buses. One important part that we haven't really invested a lot of time into is we got the fleet study. We did not get what they call an engineering or infrastructure study. And I had gone a couple of years ago to Canada and looked at Girardin Energy. They have been doing, in Canada, they have been doing EV school buses for quite some time, and they've been doing them quite successfully. So you think of the climate, cold weather, the terrain, similar to us, and they've been doing it with large and small buses there. Girardin Energy is a much more advanced than some of the EV energy partners that we have here, including Cornish Technology. And when I say here, I mean in the United States. So they are willing to do those studies for us. They were a couple years ago. There is some cost to it. I'd have to follow up on that. We were talking about that with Mr. Simons and Jen the other day. And that would really be a recommendation, is not only get an updated fleet study this year, but also based on this year's routing, but also get that infrastructure or engineering study. And that would tell us what we're really looking at for those costs. But in respect to Jen mentioning getting 2 to 4 buses with this current funding that she's asking you to approve tonight to pursue, we would not have difficulty with our current energy input into the district. So into the transportation center, and being able to use chargers to go ahead and have enough power to have those chargers operate and charge 2 to 4 buses. So that's not an immediate concern, but we need to be thinking of the full plan. We don't want to, one thing we should really consider avoiding is go ahead, get a couple of chargers, get a couple of buses, and then 3 years from now, we need different chargers, different connectors, maybe even different buses. There's different technology. So we really want to have that full scale plan for our 102 buses. That's too much.
And the other consideration too that we'll be looking at is we can still purchase fuel buses, gas or diesel buses. We don't have to start purchasing EV buses until 2027. And do we want to continue with those 8 buses that are fuel, for this cycle? And then potentially look at how our bus reserve could potentially support maybe 2 EVs. Because the other thing we want to maintain is our replacement cycle on the buses. So the delivery dates on these EV buses are further out. So we wouldn't receive, for example, if we had put 2 EV buses on the proposition in May, we likely wouldn't have delivery of those buses in 25, 26. They would come in 26, 27. So we still would need those 8 for 25, 26. So it's a little, different cycle, to consider as well. So there's
Those 8 that we would purchase this year, you can still use those up until 2035.
correct.
And they have a lifespan of
10 to 12
10 to
years,
12,
even,
right.
right? The fuel buses.
We're
So
still-
it's kind of like we're starting to get to
Yeah,
that
we talked about
point
that a
of,
few years ago too.
yeah, we're getting to that point of.
That was your idea, Mike. It's good.
I mean, we had that resolution last time to do the EV buses, which I support with the funding coming in. I need to know more about the transportation aid piece and the amortization schedule piece. Seems like a game changer to me, given the fact that it wasn't even considered last time. And that this really could expedite the use of.
Yeah, so it looks
EV
different.
buses.
Last year,
Yeah, so that's
it
important.
didn't seem affordable at all, like if we didn't
It's
get the
way
EP,
average.
right? And the EPA funding was even higher. It's actually, that 170 is less, and it would even be lower because of the other funding. But when you combine the aid components and also potential tax credits, we have to dig deeper into all of that
Right.
and evaluate. But, on the surface, it's definitely looking like
I mean, I think we should go
different
that same
picture.
route like we did last year.
Mhm.
And we have to start doing something to at least experiment, I guess you call it, with EV buses to some degree now rather than wait. I clicked on the link for the, what is it called? The fleet electrification plan.
Yeah, I put some
And
embedded
I watched
links.
a little bit of the webinar. I mean, I think we gotta do that right away. I mean,
Yeah.
There's money available for it, right?
Yes, so we need to look into it. But
I believe there's a couple component districts around us that have purchased.
Bethlehem, Muskegon.
Yes. We actually did a visit out to Bethlehem. I think, Wanda, did you go or Paul went? Both of you. That was what, a year and a half ago or so? Yeah,
We just finished an expansion there. Past summer.
Turner's been working there.
And for EV buses, we had 35 on Turner.
So they did a presentation, which was basically, they were early adopters, with things that they learned through hard lessons, and it was very helpful, I think. I mean, Wanda, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Sure. One of the things they learned when you got there, when we went, Paul and I went, they had showed that they started with, 2 buses, 2 wall chargers, and they can't use them anymore. They don't work with the current technology. So that's where they had started. So now they had these buses and they couldn't charge them with the technology they had installed. So now they looks like they already have, but they were working on a plan to correct that and expand it and update that. That was one of the things we always talk about. Isn't it great? Let's be the first one. Let's hit the news. East Greenbush, look at our great EV bus going down the road. And I know we have been wanting to explore this for the last few years since I came on board. However, this is one, and I'm always game to be first. I love it. But this was one race you didn't want to be first. You want to be right. And going over there, I think showed Paul and I, that was true. You didn't really want to go out there because all that money outlaid is really gone now. And we don't want to do that for a taxpayer. And they didn't have the funding that's come available and the timing on the funding that's come available this year that Jen's been working on. So we're in a really good position. This is good timing. So we really should be moving forward with our EV planning at this point.
Okay, thank you all. Appreciate it. Good. So I'm hearing the board is supportive of going forward with the grant application.
They extended it to next week, but yeah. I can now.
Good day. And you spread copies of this.
All right, next on the agenda is approval of programs for resident children with disabilities. Is there any questions or comments on this motion? A motion to approve. Ms. Van Orten, a second. Ms. Steinbach, is all in favor? Everyone's in favor. Motion passes. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is a resolution to amend employment agreement for Roy Stiles, Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction. Any questions or comments? A motion to approve. Mr. Mann, is there a second? Ms. Turner, all in favor? Everyone's in favor. Motion passes. And a resolution to amend the employment agreement with Ms. Mulligan, Director of Business and Finance. Is there a motion to approve? Mr. Buno, a second. Ms. Turner, all in favor? Everyone's in favor. Motion passes. And there's a resolution to amend employment agreement for Dr. Wanda McQueen, Transportation Administrator. Is there a motion to approve? Ms. Phillips, is there a second? Ms. Van Orten, all in favor? Everyone's in favor. Motion passes.
I want to thank Jennifer, Roy, and Wanda for the good job that they do, and I appreciate the board's support for their adjustments.
Thank you.
We have committee reports with Mr. Mahar and Director of Human, reading everything verbatim.
Mr. Temple. Since I've transitioned into this position, we've hired 1 school nurse, 3 teaching assistants, 3 custodial workers, 2 food service workers, 1 bus aide. And for our substitutes, we were able to increase that to 15 new aides and monitors, 4 substitute teachers added to the list, 1 substitute TA, and 1 substitute athletic trainer. Our open positions that we're still looking to fill are the reading teacher position at Belltop, which we finished final rounds with Mr. Newman the other day. DPS, Mr. Albee told me today that they're working on the speech teacher to 0.5 and 0.5 district-wide, in addition to your monitor position. Red Mill, Ellen, you have a teaching assistant that you had to repost. It's not closed yet. We have 6 typist positions that are open. In addition, we're still working on 2 custodial workers, 1 at Belltop and 1 at Green Meadow, 2 automotive mechanics, 2 food service workers, 1 monitor at DPS, which we just mentioned, a senior monitor at GOF, one certified OT assistant, which Mr. Grignam was wrapping up the other day, and one truck driver. And lastly, I'd like to announce that over the holiday week, we concluded our interviews for the director of PPS, and I see her in the audience. That's Jessica Harris. So Jessica was our final selected candidate that has accepted the position. But hang in, because you have to pass the consent agenda later, just to be official. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. So those positions you read there, those are all vacant?
Yes, we're working on them, or they're still,
Are they
or they're
posted?
posted or not.
So I'm assuming the two mechanics are for the transportation department?
Yes, and what happened with that, we had someone on board, but when he, Juan, you can help me with this, but we called him. He called back and said he got hurt on the job and he's out for a little bit, but we're hoping to keep him on the back burner. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, and the good news was that he had already this driver permit that he just,
School bus permit. Yeah.
so we almost had him. Then he got hurt. So-
He got injured in a fire. He was volunteer fire.
So these are all active postings that are out.
Some haven't closed, but some are working. So, yeah.
Because we have not hired a head mechanic yet. Is one of those right for the bus garage? Is one of these the head mechanic?
No, Nate came back in retirement and he's working as a mechanic.
Okay.
And the head mechanic position is under review for some potential reorganization that we're going to discuss with the CSEA and the board as we begin the negotiations.
Okay, so so that would be an additional appointment? To the transportation?
Yeah, that's it's a vacant position right now. Nate came back as a mechanic, not as the head mechanic. Mark calls, he's helping out with some things. But it's something that we're going to discuss with the CSEA in addition to some other types of positions that might bring people in at an entry level to train to be a mechanic. Okay, it's something that we recently discussed as we start to begin negotiations, which will happen in another month or so. We're planning hopefully to review some of the issues around the transportation garage and the CSEA before we go into negotiations. It's been difficult to fill the mechanic positions. The two positions have been vacant for quite some time. What'd you say?
So that might be interesting.
Oh, that's right. Marty was a mechanic before he became an educator. He's in one interim position. He's already trying to move up another one.
So I said to my secretary tonight, wow, we got a lot of hiring jobs. She goes, it's good because this is slow time of year. We'll see what's out there. Thank you, Marty.
Any table motions? Nothing, old business?
Yes, old business. So we had talked, I believe at the beginning of the school year, and I know I asked about the governor extending the waiver process.
Yes,
And now rumor is she is going to extend it.
don't know. The conversation has changed, though. Last year, we were advised that the waiver process was going to be the last year.
Mhm.
But some of the advocacy groups, including NISCUS, have continued to talk with the governor's office and the legislature, and they seem to be a little bit more inclined to be open to it. It will happen in the final budget, whether that happens or not. And some of the ideas that are being discussed include, proposals that if someone is hired back in retirement, the district pays into the retirement system for them. So that's a conversation that's occurring right now. We don't have any clarity until the budget is done, which is supposed to be done on April 1st, but there seems to be more of an understanding that this ability of the district to be able to hire people in retirement is needed still because of the workforce shortages. And I think there were some different perceptions around it that I think are clearing up and making the state more open to possibly considering it again.
So it'll be in the budget then?
Yes.
Potentially, right. Yes, no, that is good news.
Yeah.
Because it won't lose some of our folks. Yeah. Thank you.
Question, Mr. Simons. Is there anything stopping the district from like even if there wasn't a waiver from taking on the interim and paying, like, so I'm trying to say if that condition of paying the retirement on the district anyway, right? Like what would stop the district even without that being waived from the district from taking on that responsibility themselves and fulfilling that
It's not permissible. I mean,
Okay.
in other words, we
Okay.
pay into the retirement system, the employer contribution based on active employees. We pay in the TRS system, teacher retirement system, for certified administrators, certified teachers. And we pay into ERS for all the non-instructional employees. It's a formula based on the salaries.
Yeah, it's basically a percentage of salaries depending on what tier the active employee is a member of.
So it's not an individual thing where you can say, well, we'll do this for one. It has to be a systems change at the state level.
But then it would be, the employee could still stay. It just would affect the retirement.
Yes.
Right,
Right.
so that's the
From the
effect of the
previous
waiver.
job.
They can't collect their
Right,
retirement and
Right,
be
and
an
that's what
active
the whole
employee.
waiver does, is
does
allow you
allow
to
them.
go over that state cap
Yeah,
for New York State retirement. So
exactly.
some employees could say, yeah, we'll stay, and then they get penalized on the retirement.
Or have to
but
pause
they
it.
stay-
or-
Right,
Mhm.
pause it and then wait for it to kick back in again. Or my concern is that some are gonna say they don't want to lose the retirement, so they're gonna step down from their position, and now we've lost some good people.
We had, last we reviewed it, we had 12 last year when we talked about this, we had 12 employees in the district that were retirees and coming back and providing support and services for the kids. And in all different positions, administrative, teachers, some of our safety supervisors are retired police officers, and others, bus drivers. So it's really important because we have shortages that in fact, we have our advocacy committee meeting tomorrow, and that's one on my list.
All right. Next on the radar is the consent agenda. Is there any questions or comments?
We just include the addendum.
Yeah,
So there's an addendum.
absolutely.
It's part of consent.
I have just a question on item F. Is there a, cap on how much time? Just thinking about some other conversations we've had.
This resolution involves an individual employee for which the teachers union wants to donate individually to her for a sick bank donation. And there as part of the agreement, which is confidential, I did send that to the board. In the event that all of the days are not utilized, there's a mechanism of how to redistribute those days. And but there's not a limit on it at this point. I can double check that. Give me just a minute. I'll look up the agreement. Yeah, I had it. Let me just clarify if I don't want to misspeak.
Do you mean a limit on how many days can be donated to that individual? Is that what you mean? Oh.
Of the donor versus the person receiving them.
Oh, no, like the.
I have it
what
right
the
here.
total
Give me just a
that
second.
can be received.
I have it right here. So there is a limit in the sense of the EGTA agrees to allow members to donate up to 2 days of their accrued sick time to this individual for family care. Should more than 20% of the days that were donated to the individual, the EGTA in the district would have to meet to discuss the redisposition of the unused days. Should 20% or fewer of the donated be used, they shall be added to the sick leave pool set forth in Article 5 of the collective bargaining agreement.
Right. So adding the addendum to the consent agenda, is there a motion to approve? Mr. Buno, second. Mr. Mann, all in favor? Everyone's in favor. Motion passes. Congratulations. Absolutely. Yes.
So Jessica Harris will be joining us officially on February 10th. She is currently a director of student services at the Queensbury Central School District, which is a comparable position to the director of PPS that she'll be moving into. And Mr. Stiles and Mr. Mahar handled the process, and I think we have a very good candidate. So congratulations, welcome.
And is there any new business on the board? None. Last public forum. And last board forum, start on my left with Ms. Van Orton.
All set.
Right.
Go ahead, Jesse. Thank you.
Mr. Mann. Right.
I'm good.
Ms. Phillips. Right. And there is a need for executive session today.
Several matters related to the employment history of particular individuals
All right. And this
and
meeting,
negotiation issues.
okay. And is there a motion to adjourn? Mr. Mann?
Motion to go into executive session.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah, motion to go into executive session. Mr. Mann, second. Ms. Turner, all in favor? Everyone's in favor.